Okay, and a happy Christmas to you all. As you can see from my tree behind, final PowerPoint here on sociological theories of criminality, and today we're going to look at realism, and we're going to look at left and right realism. We're going to evaluate them both, and we're going to look at how they've informed policy. So there's quite a lot of detail in this PowerPoint. It's quite a long one, a lot of slides to get through. So without further ado, let's make a start. So we know that sociological theories of crime are saying that social factors play a part in crime, generally assume that social class is a mitigating factor there, and that the primary causes of crime and criminal behaviour begins in youth, and it's largely a result of unfavourable conditions such as unemployment, single parent families, etc. And as I said, we're going to look at realism in this presentation. And realism is rooted in politics. So right realists have a right-wing conservative political outlook, and left realists have a left-wing socialist political outlook in relation to crime and deviance. So they are very much at polar opposites of each other. So let's start by looking at right realism. It originated in the 1970s, and it was particularly advocated by right realist sociologists such as James Q. Wilson and Ernst van den Haag. That's Wilson up here, van den Haag there. And basically it developed as a critique of sociological theory which had failed to solve the problem of crime. Right realists believed that sociological theories of crime hadn't solved the issue. So right realism developed as a response to that. So it would be true to say that the basis of right realism is a very negative view of human nature, and that is that basically human beings are naturally selfish and greedy. We are not a pleasant bunch to know. So this quote by Henry Ford would sum it up nicely. Money doesn't change men, it merely unmasks them. If a man is naturally selfish or arrogant or greedy, then money brings that out, that's all. So therefore, this aspect of human nature needs to be subject to social controls and socialised in some way into appropriate behaviour. So we start our look at right realism by looking at rational choice theory. So this is part of right realism, and basically the solution to crime for right realists lies with this idea of this concept of rational choice theory. So you've got to be able to refer to this when you're talking about right realism. So basically rational choice theory is arguing that criminals that will engage in crime if the benefits outweigh the costs. So, you know, because we're naturally greedy, we're naturally selfish, our propensity, our predilection, our default is to want to commit crime and get the stuff we want. But obviously there are things that stop us from doing that. So if the cost of crime outweighs the benefit of it, we're less likely to do it. So the solution is really simple. Increase the costs of crime, increase the likelihood of being caught, and tougher punishments. That is a right realist view. Okay, so end the soft prison sentences. That's what right realists would go down the route of. So right realists would see the causes of crime. They have an interesting view on it. They really they oppose any connection sociologists have made, such as Marxists, between crime and poverty. They say, you know, with increased affluence, crime rates have soared, not with increased poverty. Right realists argue that things like feckless parenting, absent fathers, lack of discipline in school, liberal policies of the state have all served to actually increase crime. Rising crime levels don't reflect poverty, they reflect ineffective and inadequate social control. So this idea of feckless parenting, generally incompetent, ineffectual, unfit to assume responsibility. Permissive attitudes have allowed us to be self-indulgent, and they promote antisocial behaviour. So the result of all this has been a spiralling volume of muggings and graffiti and vandalism, car break-ins, thefts, assaults, etc., burglaries, robberies. It's society that is to blame. So what are their solutions? Well, all you have to do is reduce opportunities for offending, increase the costs of crime so that they exceed the benefits, and basically your crime control should fall upon members of the community. You encourage responsible parenting, you encourage active citizenship, and these people challenge antisocial behaviour. And your punishments need to be tough, heavy fines, heavy long sentences. Many right realists would advocate the use of corporal punishment, physical punishment, and certainly the death sentence for capital punishment. You know, here's a classic one from Facebook that I found. If we want to make America great again, we will have to make evil people fear punishment again. That is a right realist view of crime. So, right realism is also linked to the idea of broken window theory. Got a really good clip that you can watch there on that, so by all means, if you're watching on my channel, just jot down the address and go to it on YouTube. Well worth a look. But broken window theory, so you would link this through to right realism, was first advocated by James Q. Wilson, and he says that basically, unless you deal with the incivilities, the little things such as litter, graffiti, noise levels, vandalism, etc., unless you keep those to a minimum, then wider antisocial behaviour and more serious crime will follow. So that's the idea, that if you see a broken window and you don't repair it instantly, it will encourage people to break more windows, and then what happens is more windows get broken, the place looks horrible, therefore people then spray graffiti, then the place doesn't get used at all. So I'm sort of trying to show how this might work with the graffiti on the inside of this New York Metro, I think it is. But also, as a response to broken window theory, Wilson advocates that the police adopt a policy of zero tolerance. So zero tolerance is a really common thing you'll see with right realism for even minor crimes, as tried by the Mayor of New York, Mayor Giuliani, who introduced a 3 strikes and you're out policy in New York. And I'll be looking at that in a little more detail as we go on. Okay. And if you want to see the impact of that 3 strikes and you're out theory, you could go to this YouTube clip, which is again extremely good, gives you some idea on that. So have a look at that if you so wish. So Wilson argues you've got 3 factors that affect long-term crime. You've got the number of young males who are your typical deviants. Notice how labelling theorists would react to this. You label them, you then create that self-fulfilling prophecy. But right realists, it's young males who are your typical deviants. You've got to do something about your cost benefits of crime through your rational choice theory. And they also talk about inadequate socialization into norms and values of society, feckless parenting, whatever. So to deal with this, what Wilson says, you've got to target, harden deviant groups and areas, and you do that through proactive, not reactive policing. So what does that actually mean? Well, let's go back to inadequate or inappropriate socialization to start off with. Right realists would blame crime on inadequate or inappropriate socialization by the key agencies within society that socialize people. So it's the non-traditional family. So it's single parent families. Right realists would view that as a major factor. So the fact that there isn't a father figure at home possibly, or a mother figure at home, means that deviance is created. Now, whether you want to hold that view is up to you, but that's what right realists think. They would argue that a lack of discipline in schools is a key factor in allowing youth to misbehave. A mass media that glamorizes deviance and crime, the decline in religious values are other important contributory factors to the general decline in society. And this guy here, Charles Murray, argues that the underclass, as he calls them, are particularly insufficiently integrated into society's norms and values. And he views the underclass as prone to criminal tendencies, they're violent, illegitimacy, so they don't care how many kids they have with how many different people, promiscuity, so they're very sexually active, educational failures, they're dependent on the welfare state. It's all those sort of things. So right realist view. And Ernst van der Haag, we looked at him earlier on, here he is again, adopts a very poor view of humanity. He says they're willing to cheat to get on, and therefore some groups need to be controlled for their own good and that of society. And therefore, van der Haag actually argues it is reasonable for law and order agencies to target the poor. Lovely man. He advocates a tough penal system of punishment, which can be both corporal, so give you a good slap on the hand, the cane, etc., and capital. So again, you get this as a feel for how right realism is in terms of its attitude to crime. Again, I'm going to go back to labelling theory. You know, there's an awful lot of labelling goes on with right realism. So let's evaluate its effectiveness. Well, the strength, zero tolerance, has been successfully adopted as a policy in New York. When they adopted it, crime rates went down. It offers a more practical approach to tackling crime than other theories such as Marxism or labelling theory. And research by Flood, Page et al. In 2000 does support the view that the decline of the family, mum, dad, children, did found that children, particularly males from lone parent backgrounds and step families, were more likely to offend than those who lived with natural parents. So there is some evidence for it. And there is support for rational choice theory. Rettig gave students a scenario of an opportunity to commit a crime, and he found that the degree of punishment determined whether they chose to commit crime. So the harsher the punishment, the less likely they were to commit crime. So there is some element of truth behind rational choice theory. If we move through to the limitations, well, some argue that it's a complete lack of investment in deprived areas rather than incivilities of the people themselves that cause crime to rise. And that would be your Marxist view of crime. Marxists argue that the concentration on minor offences means that the more serious crimes get ignored by the authorities, particularly white-collar crime. And where zero tolerance is introduced, this, many people argue, just simply shifts crime to other areas where there isn't zero tolerance. If we then move on to looking at the limitations further, you could argue it too readily accepts crime statistics, for example, doesn't explain white-collar crime, I've already mentioned that, and it focuses on young males and street crime, which is not the only crimes that are committed within society. At the same time, the right realist view that individuals choose crime freely does conflict with the view that behaviour is determined by biological factors, and you can go back to all the biological theories for crime that we did that will look at that. Okay. And then the other thing to consider is that not all crimes are a result of rational decisions. Violent crime, for instance, is often impulsive. Offenders under the influence of drugs or alcohol may also be unlikely to calculate the risks, for want of a better word, and rewards before they offend, because they're being influenced by the drugs and alcohol, not by rational choice. So this then moves us on to how right realism has informed policy development. And there's quite a bit of policy that right realism has informed. So there's quite a bit on this. So we can start off by looking at situational crime prevention, which is SCP. Okay. Now, SCP policies are those that try to reduce opportunities for crime by increasing the risk or difficulties of committing the crime, and also by reducing the rewards. So it's based on rational choice theory, which is the idea that the offender acts rationally, weighs up the risks and rewards of a crime opportunity. And so SCP would advocate things like target hardening measures. So make it harder to commit a crime in the first place. Here's some target hardening to stop people, ram raiding, etc. You've got these concrete bollards here. Or you could say, look at locking cars. employing security guards, reshaping the environment to design crime out of an area. So reshaping the environment is SEPTEM, crime prevention through environmental design. We will look at that in much more detail in Unit 4, but there's a whole PowerPoint on my YouTube channel on that if you wish to look at that in more detail, should you so wish. But there are some problems with situational crime prevention. It may seem to make sense. However, you could argue that what you'll get with situational crime prevention is displacement. So if we think, as right realists do, that criminals act rationally, then when they find a target too hard to crack, they'll simply look for a softer one. For example, they would commit crime in a different place or at a different time, or they'd use a different method or choose a different target. And that could mean that it results in more vulnerable targets, such as the old, the poor or disabled, being victimized more because other targets have been hardened. So that's something to consider under SCP. Another policy that right realism might inform would be environmental crime protection or crime prevention. So we're going back to broken windows theory here, because broken windows theory is arguing that if you have a disorderly neighbourhood, that sends out the message that nobody cares. That then attracts offenders who calculate their activities that there won't be investigated. So therefore serious crimes increase, law-abiding citizens move out if they can. So broken windows theory calls for a twofold reaction to that. So two things you need to do to stop things spiralling out of control. The first is an environmental improvement strategy, which is the idea that all signs of disorder are tackled promptly. So you remove graffiti as soon as it appears. You repair those broken windows. So it looks like someone is looking after the place, controlling it, so the situation doesn't spiral out of control. And the second thing is then going back to that idea of zero tolerance policing strategy, ZTP. Talked about it already. So taking a tough, zero tolerance stance towards all crime, even the most trivial. So this is the argument from right realists that police should concentrate on tackling quality of life offences such as aggressive begging, prostitution, vandalism, etc. And to consider when we're talking about environmental crime prevention, crime fell after particularly I'm focusing here on zero tolerance policing. Crime fell after zero tolerance policing was introduced by Mayor Giuliani in New York in the 1990s. However, this may be due to other factors. For instance, at the same time, US cities that had not adopted zero tolerance policing also saw crime fell. So it may have been a much more sociological thing compared to actually the introduction of zero tolerance policing. And some zero tolerance policing studies have found that curfews can actually increase juvenile crime, because what they do is they remove law-abiding youths from the street, which then leaves the streets emptier and more favourable towards the criminal. At the same time, it would be very true to say that zero tolerance policing can lead to targeting of ethnic minorities due to police racism and to confrontations due to heavy-handed, for want of a better word, military-style policing. And so it's true to say that ZTP and SCP they fail to tackle structural causes of crime, such as inequality. They focus on low-level street crime and they ignore the crimes of the powerful, such as white-collar and state crime. The other thing we can look at when it comes to how right realism has informed policy development is penal populism and imprisonment. And this is the idea that because right realists are arguing that criminals make a rational choice to offend by weighing up the costs and benefits of offending, higher costs such as tougher penalties should therefore deter criminals. So here's Michael Howard in 1993, he was the then Home Secretary, saying prison really works. It's no coincidence that recorded crime has fallen by record amounts over the last 4 years at the same time that the prison population has risen. So prison works. This idea came from the 1990s governments, from the 1990s, where governments began to take the view that tougher penalties were needed, arguing that prison works. So in the right realist view, prison has two functions. It's to incapacitate, so criminals become incapable of harming the public, jail takes them out of circulation, and it also acts as a deterrence because criminals think twice before offending when they see these tougher punishments being handed out. So talking about penal populism and imprisonment now. So we know that politicians believe that tough penalties were popular with the public, so that's why this policy became known as penal populism. So you issue a tougher penalty, that becomes popular with the public, penal populism. So for example, in 1997, the Conservatives brought in the Crime Sentences Act, and that introduced mandatory minimum sentences for repeat offences or offenders. So for instance, if you committed a second serious sexual or violence offence, you received an automatic life sentence. If you were caught for a third time trafficking Class A drugs, you received a minimum sentence of 7 years. If you committed your third domestic burglary, minimum of 3 years sentences for 3 strikes. So very similar to what they were doing in New York. And then when the New Labour took over in 1997, their mantra, here is Tony Blair, Labour's a party of law and order in Britain today, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. This motto, tough on the crime and tough on the causes of crime. And to show that, they brought in measures such as ASBOs and curfews. But penal populism has led to rising numbers in jail. So in 1993 we had 45,000 people in jail. As I speak, it's 80,000, so it's nearly doubled. England and Wales imprison a bigger proportion of their population than any other Western European country. And in 2020 in our prisons there were 76 suicides, 5 murders, 65,000 incidences of self-harm and 9,800 assaults on staff. So you can make your own decision as you think whether or not penal populism works or not. So things to consider with penal populism and imprisonment. Incapacitation, this is what right realists are looking for. Well, you could argue that prison might be said to work temporarily because offenders can't commit crimes against the public while they're in jail. However, there's evidence to suggest they do offend against fellow inmates and staff. At the same time, if we're looking at rehabilitation, you could argue that one function of prison is to rehabilitate offenders, but if you bang more and more people into prison, what you get is overcrowding, you get budget cuts, that means prisoners lack access to education, lack access to skills training or treatment programs that would help them to become law-abiding citizens on release. So there's issues with penal populism. If you get too many people in, you can't do that sort of work. You've then got recidivism. Imprisonment seems to be ineffective in preventing recidivism, repeat offending. In our country, UK, 48% of adults are reconvicted within a year of release. So something isn't right there. And finally, deterrence. Well, right realists argue that the risk of jail deters would-be criminals who make rational choices about offending. However, lots of studies show that the risk of imprisonment doesn't actually deter offenders enough to affect overall crime rates. So that then brings us on to left realism. Very different from right realism, as you'll see. So left realism was developed by Jock Young, this guy here, John Lee, Roger Matthews, as a response to the influence of right realism. Left realism sees crime as a real problem for ordinary people, and it explains crime through analysing social and economic relationships and how some groups become marginalised. So left realists argue that the rising crime rate can't solely be explained by the unreliability of official crime statistics. So unusually for sociologists, criminologists, they're less critical of crime statistics than most and argue that they do reflect typical criminals who are young, male, working class and disproportionately black. Left realism focuses on victims as well as offenders. It recognises that crime is concentrated in the inner city and in particular in sink housing estates such as this one here. And I'm going to explain left realism through a case study. So you can apply all of these factors to any case study, but we're going to look at ethnicity in crime. So Lee and Young particularly tackle black criminality head on. And Lee and Young accept that there's been a real increase in crimes committed by young blacks. They accept that there exists institutional racism and a racist canteen culture, lads around the water cooler amongst the police. But they argue that black criminality also stems from racial discrimination, material deprivation, low wages and unemployment. They see black youth as having particularly high aspirations, but they often are not able to legitimately achieve these aspirations. There's a slight link here with Merton and strain theory to a certain extent. So basically, when left realism talks about the origins of crime, there are three things that bring crime about. So three things, you need to apply these and need to know them. They are subculture, they're relative deprivation, and they are marginalisation. And obviously, left realists would say, we look at this case study of ethnicity. These three things, when we look at them in detail, and I'm going to go on and do that in the next few slides, explain why black working class males are particularly associated with criminal activity. If we take subculture, okay, Lee and Young argue the subculture of young blacks is distinctly different from their parents, who largely accept their marginalised position in society. They say that black youth subculture has high material expectations and aspirations. So the idea that one should have money, status symbols like flash cars, etc. Here's your role model. And so because black youth is so closely enmeshed in consumption, style and wealth, this is precisely why they engage in crime, because they have blocked opportunities, they can't get it a legitimate way. So again, we're linking through to strain theory to some extent. If we look at relative deprivation, Lee and Young argue that frustrated from this unfairness, this disparity within society between the expectations and the reality of their lifestyle, this leads to feelings of relative deprivation. So they argue that the reality is, for many young black males, they've got a choice of unemployment, a training scheme, or as Stuart Hall, this man here in the Sociologist writes, or white man shit work. Interesting view. They feel unfairly denied those glittering prizes that are offered to others that are somewhat better off in society. And so this resentment develops into strategies that involve deviant and criminal behaviour. And if we then take that third concept, which is marginalisation, Lee and Young argue that marginalisation means the process by which certain groups find themselves on the edge of society. So white and black working class youth often feel alienated by schools, unemployment, low wages, the police, etc. So young black males face marginalisation through prejudice and harassment, such as military policing, stop and search tactics, that sort of thing. So they argue that this can be, Lee and Young argue this is a straw that breaks the camel's back. Economic marginalisation is then transferred into criminal activity. So that is left realism in terms of how it causes crime, etc. If we're then going to evaluate it, if we look at the strengths, well, it draws attention to the importance of poverty, inequality, relative deprivation as the underlying structural causes of crime. So that's a strength. It also draws the attention to the reality of street crime and its effects, especially on victims from deprived groups. And it explores the role of the victim of crime especially the poor or vulnerable, in much more depth than any other criminological theory. And it recognises the multiple causes of crime. So if we then look at the limitations of left realism, well, you can say it over-predicts the amount of working class crime. Not everyone who experiences relative deprivation and marginalisation turns to crime. It would imply that everyone would, but they don't. It focuses on high crime in inner city. So the fact that it focuses on high crime in inner city areas gives an unrepresentative view and makes crime appear a greater problem than it is. And also it fails to address white collar or corporate crime. So then this finally leads us on to how left realism has informed policy development. So just a reminder that left realists see the root cause of crime as being an unequal, unfair social structure. And so really their theory has been applied to three main policies to reduce crime. So first one, any policy to reduce inequality is going to be linked to left realism. So left realists would call for major structural changes to tackle things like discrimination, inequality of opportunity, unfairness of rewards, to provide good jobs, housing for all, and they would argue this would reduce relative deprivation, and of course that's one of the main causes of crime. So get rid of relative deprivation, you don't have crime. Secondly, they would advocate democratic policing. Now, the police are losing public support, especially in poorer areas, because they're where they're widely distrusted. And if they're widely distrusted, their flow of information dries up, and then they have to rely on military policing, such as stop and searches, to combat crime. And that then creates a further loss of cooperation, which means they can't tackle crime effectively. So to win back public support, left realists would say that the police need to involve local communities in deciding their priorities. They've got to focus on crimes that victimise the disadvantaged, such as domestic violence and hate crimes, rather than offences such as, let's say, the possession of soft drugs. So they would advocate things like neighbourhood policing and police community support officers, PCSOs, and they've been introduced to help build better relationships within communities. Many forces are now making cannabis possession a low priority crime, and certainly domestic violence and hate crime are now a much higher priority. So that shows the impact of democratic policing. At the same time, they would also, my final slide here, advocate a multi-agency approach. So left realists argue that crime control must involve many other agencies apart from the police. So it's got to involve schools, youth services, housing departments, social service, probation service, the NHS. Local councils can improve facilities for young people to provide alternatives to crime if these groups work together. And one example you can use as a policy that's got a multi-agency approach is the No Knives Better Lives campaign. It's an example of a multi-agency approach, joined up approach aimed at reducing knife crime. It involved a wide range of agencies such as schools, local councils, leisure and youth services, voluntary organisations, as well as the police, in an attempt to combat knife crime. So that's left and right realism. I hope it all makes sense, and I will see you soon for my next PowerPoint. Take care and have a good Christmas.